We know that total weekly volume is a key variable influencing muscle growth. However, when distributing this volume throughout the week, is it better to simply do more sets with fewer exercises, or should we do fewer sets but implement more exercises for each muscle group? In this video, we will explore this topic. First, we need to understand what volume is and its relationship with muscle growth. In the context of hypertrophy training, volume refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. This is because hypertrophy can be equally achieved using different rep ranges, loads, exercises, and training methods. So essentially, as long as we are training fairly close to failure, lifting somewhere in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range, and making sure the target muscle is the limiting factor, then each set will be similarly hypertrophic. So the most accurate and practical method to quantify volume is to simply use the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. As an example, let's use this training program. If we want to calculate how much volume is performed for the back, for example, we simply need to look at all the back exercises and add together how many sets are performed throughout the week. In this example, we have 6 sets of back training on day 1 and 6 sets on day 3, giving a total of 12 weekly sets. This same concept can also be used for each muscle group to calculate weekly volume. So what influence does volume have on muscle growth? Well, it is quite clear from the current evidence that volume appears to have a significant effect on hypertrophy gains. With all other factors being equal, more volume tends to result in more muscle growth, even up to extreme levels. For example, this study found that volume had a dose-response relationship with muscle growth. In other words, the groups who performed more volume consistently saw greater muscle growth for all muscles measured. This was even the case for the quad muscles, which were trained with a crazy high volume of 45 sets per week in the high volume group. So basically, we can achieve muscle growth even with fairly low volumes, but higher volumes tend to result in a faster rate of muscle growth. This means we may reach our hypertrophy goals in a faster time frame, but the long-term effects of training with different volumes are still not entirely clear. So when we want to increase volume, or decrease volume for that matter, in our training program, should we change how many exercises we perform? Or should we keep the number of exercises the same and just change how many sets we do? For example, let's compare these two back training sessions. In the first session, we have 3 sets of pull-ups, 3 sets of barbell rows, 3 sets of lat pull-downs, and 3 sets of cable rows, giving us a total of 12 sets. In the second example, we have 6 sets of pull-ups and 6 sets of seated cable rows, also giving us a total of 12 sets. However, as we can see, the first session involved 4 exercises, while the second session only involves 2 exercises, despite volume being the same. So which one of these sessions is better for muscle growth? Well, in the grand scheme of things, it is unlikely to make much of a difference when total weekly volume is equated. This was shown in this systematic review, which compared the evidence on volume-matched training protocols. It was concluded that, like we mentioned earlier, the total number of sets performed per week is the biggest predictor of hypertrophy outcomes, even with different frequencies, loads, and rep ranges. So, although this review didn't directly compare volume-matched training protocols with different numbers of exercises and sets, we can probably make some extrapolations here. Total weekly volume seems to be the biggest indicator of hypertrophy gains. So whether we manipulate the number of exercises or number of sets, hypertrophy outcomes are likely to be very similar, provided that volume is equated. So, although muscle growth is likely to be similar in either case, there may still be some small differences in hypertrophy outcomes due to a number of factors, which we will now cover. The first consideration is for the concept of training variation and monotony. These are 2 opposite sides of the same spectrum. On one side, we have highly variable training. This refers to changing our training routine very frequently. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have monotonous training, which refers to always performing the exact same routine with no change. In terms of hypertrophy, there is probably a balance we want to have on this spectrum. Changing variables too quickly may not give us enough time to adapt to the training stimulus, while keeping training exactly the same for too long may result in stagnant progress if continued for an extended period of time. So while there is a balance here, we probably want to err slightly on the side of monotonous training to maximize muscle growth. I don't think that we should be changing variables too quickly. Rather, it is probably best to stay in an effective training routine which is individualized to our needs that we know is effective for us for a good amount of time. To demonstrate this idea, let's look at this study which explored the effects of changing exercises each week versus maintaining the same exercises each week on hypertrophy over an 8-week training program. As we can see in the orange bars, keeping exercises consistent across the training program resulted in superior muscle growth of the quad muscles, which unfortunately were the only muscles measured in this study. Although this is an extreme example of training variation, where exercises were changed every single week, it shows that we are probably better off keeping exercises consistent in a training program, at least in the short to moderate term. Although this isn't directly related to the topic of this video, it may have some implications. It suggests that we probably don't want to implement too many different exercises for a single muscle group. Rather, we may be better off selecting the exercises that we enjoy and work well for us, and sticking with those for a good while. Another consideration about how many exercises we distribute our volume across is the anatomy of the target muscle. Each muscle has a different anatomical structure, and this will influence how many exercises are required to maximally train them. Some muscles have highly variable fiber orientations and contribute to many different movements. Other muscles have a more uniform fiber structure and contribute to very few movements. For example, the trapezius has a more variable fiber structure. As we can see, the upper fibers run more upward, the middle fibers run mostly horizontal, and the lower fibers run more downward. This means the trapezius contributes to scapular elevation, as seen during something like a shrug, scapular retraction, as seen during something like a row, and scapular depression, as seen during something like a lat pull-down. So to maximally train the trapezius, we will probably need to spread our volume across multiple different exercises. In opposition, a muscle like the biceps has a much more uniform fiber orientation. As we can see, all fibers essentially run in the same direction, and therefore all contribute to the same movements. So for a muscle like the biceps, we probably don't need to include as many exercises for all fibers to be maximally recruited and trained. And the last theoretical factor influencing our decision is the introduction of novelty. Although we mentioned that training variation is not ideal for hypertrophy gains, it can have a positive effect from a long-term perspective. Once we have performed the same training routine for a long period of time, it may be beneficial to switch up our program. The main way to do this is by changing exercises. This introduces a novel stimulus, which can theoretically spark some new muscle growth in the short term. So once we have become accustomed to a training protocol, it could be a good idea to switch exercises. This is important to consider when deciding how many exercises you want to distribute your volume across. This is because if we implement too many exercises in a single program, we will have fewer variations to switch to once we've become accustomed to the current routine. So in most cases, I don't think we should just throw in every effective exercise for each muscle group, rather we should leave some out, so that we have options to switch to in a few months or years' time. So now we have explored the theoretical considerations about how many exercises we want to distribute our volume across. Now we need to explore the practical considerations which may also influence our decision. First is equipment availability. Depending on where we train, we may be limited in what equipment we have available. Therefore, the number of exercises we can perform may be limited for each muscle group. For example, if we train in a home gym with just a barbell, plates, and a rack, we have far fewer exercise options compared with a fully equipped commercial gym. In this case, even if it would be theoretically beneficial to implement more exercises, we simply cannot do so. Therefore, if we want to increase volume, we have to just perform more sets of the same exercises. The second practical consideration is equipment setup. The more exercises we have in a single training session, the more equipment we need to set up and pack away. While this has nothing to do with hypertrophy gains directly, it is definitely an important consideration from a practical perspective. This can make the training session more inconvenient for a variety of reasons. If we train at a busy time in the gym, for example, we may have to wait for equipment to become available before we can use it. It will also take longer to set up and pack up equipment for each exercise, and it means we may need to do more warm-up sets for each new exercise, compared with performing more sets with fewer exercises. So in most cases, implementing more exercises, even with the same amount of volume, makes the training session less time efficient. And the last practical consideration is the enjoyment factor. Some people prefer to have more variety in their training routine, while others enjoy a simpler protocol. Therefore, trainees should probably err on the side of their preferences, since actual hypertrophy outcomes are likely to be fairly similar. Sticking to a training routine that you enjoy can help with effort, motivation, and long-term adherence to resistance training. So from a long-term perspective, this will likely result in greater gains compared with a theoretically optimal routine that you don't enjoy. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. First, it should be understood that total weekly volume is the most important variable about this discussion. Whether we change the number of exercises we perform or we change the number of sets probably doesn't have a major influence on muscle growth outcomes, provided that volume is equated. However, there is probably a balance here, where we don't want to perform too many exercises for any particular muscle group, and we don't want to perform too few. As a practical guideline, I would recommend to perform around 2 to 4 exercises per muscle group across the week. Some muscles may require more exercises to maximize muscle growth, such as the pecs, lats, and trapezius, while other muscles may not need as many exercises, such as the biceps, hamstrings, and calves. Furthermore, our decision should be based on practical considerations too, such as equipment availability, equipment setup, and what training styles we enjoy. Then, once we have implemented our chosen number of exercises, we can then further manipulate volume by adjusting the number of sets for each exercise.